Robert, Lisa, good morning. Thank you for joining me today in my office to review the investment analysis portion of the financial plan that I've been working on for the two of you. I want to go ahead and get us started today, first and foremost by setting an agenda, and then we'll just dive right in from there. So first and foremost, I want to recap some of the goals and concerns that we've discussed from a financial standpoint over the prior weeks. After that, we're going to dive into some of the findings that I have on your portfolio and answer some of the specific questions you had asked me during our meetings over the preceding weeks. And then finally, we'll review my recommendations for your portfolio. Now, coming back to the goals and concerns, the two of you have shared with me it's very important that you want to retire in the next few months if it's possible. And when you retire, you want to maintain an income of $15,000 per month in addition to whatever is received from Social Security. Now, an additional consideration of that is that if, Robert, you predecease Lisa, you want Lisa to be able to maintain that $15,000 a month income stream while also preserving as many assets as possible to pass on to your sons, Jeffrey and Lewis. So we have a lot of really great financial priorities we're working towards, and we have some really great assets or resources that we're using to get there. So just a quick run through of your assets you've shared with me. Robert, you shared with me you have a $300,000 Roth IRA that's invested in a laddered treasury bond strategy. You've also shared with me that you have a $300,000 traditional IRA that's currently invested in what you would classify as low to medium risk equity mutual funds. And then finally, we have $270,000 in the individual stock portfolio that is maintained by Lisa, who you had some very specific questions on that I'm going to get to in a minute. Now, what that totals is $870,000 in total investment assets. Now, two of the things that are not addressed here is the $1.2 million pension plan. Reason being is we have not decided at this point what it is we're going to do with that, so there are no asset allocation decisions to be made, as well as the single payment deferred annuity. Now, Lisa, I mentioned that you would express some interest in getting some very specific questions answered about your portfolios, given that you've taken a real interest in investment management and the capital markets. So I want to go ahead and address those first, and then we'll cycle back to the overall recommendations for your portfolio. So to start off, Lisa, you had asked me very specifically what the weighted beta of your portfolio is. Now, just to recap, beta is a measure of overall volatility or sensitivity, as well as systematic risk. Now, systematic risk cannot be diversified away. An example of systematic risk would be a global financial crisis, very similar to what we had in 2008, where basically whatever asset class you own, it was all affected. You cannot diversify systematic risk away. So basically the overall market has a beta coefficient of 1. If your portfolio had a beta coefficient of greater than 1, it would be deemed to have more systematic risk, to be more volatile than the overall market. If it were less than 1, then the portfolio would be deemed to be less volatile than the market overall. So your portfolio, when I ran the calculations, came in at a beta of 1.08. So slightly more volatile than the market, what we'd expect it to be, but not very far off from the 1, which is the overall market. Now, you also asked me what risks you should be concerned with when it came to your investment portfolio, and there's quite a few. Number one, systematic risk, which is what we just discussed with beta. Those are things that you cannot diversify away. If there is a global financial crisis or name any other type of major negative event, most assets are going to be affected. On the flip side, there's unsystematic risk, which can be diversified away by owning enough different types of asset classes and different types of further diversification inside of those asset classes. And you are very subject to unsystematic risk as well, given that you have a lot of high concentration in the individual positions you hold, given that you have almost half your portfolio invested in 4 individual stocks. That is a high concentration portfolio. Now, on the flip side, you also asked me, Lisa, are there risks in your portfolio specific to your bonds that you're not subject? And the answer to that is yes. You are not subject to what we would call default risk on your bond positions, and that being because you own government securities, U.S. government treasuries to be specific, which are classified as being risk-free. Basically, there's virtually no risk that the United States government defaults, so therefore we would basically consider that money guaranteed. Now, one of the other questions you asked me was you were curious about the performance of your portfolio relative to expectations. So to determine that first, I had to utilize some assumptions that we agreed upon, one being a 2% risk-free rate, and then also a 7.1% 7.1% market risk premium. Now, what I did was utilize a calculation called the capital asset pricing model, which, given the risk-free rate, the market risk premium, and the beta of the portfolio that we just spoke about, an expected or required return of that portfolio. When I ran the numbers, the expected return given the beta of the portfolio would have been 7.5% over the last 5 years. What you've actually returned was 7.46%. So you have a 0.04% differential there, or underperformance to the downside. Any questions on that? Okay. The very last question you had asked me was, which one of my individual stocks has performed the best? And the method I use to generate that answer for you, find that answer for you, is something called the Trainer ratio. And what the Trainer ratio shows us is a risk-adjusted return. And we're very familiar with this risk-return paradox, so to speak, is we can't expect to get any return unless we put something at risk. There's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to the markets. So by using this specific calculation, I came up with stock D in your portfolio has given you the greatest amount of return per unit of risk that you've taken. So that would be your top performer. Are there any other questions or items that you want me to address as it relates to your individual portfolio holdings, Lisa? Okay. So I'm going to route back towards the overall portfolio and my recommendations. So coming back to the goal, these assets are going to play a very large role in your ability to retire. And it's very important that we have a strategy around these assets. Would you agree? Exactly. So we want to move forward and we want to make sure we have an allocation. So when I drafted your investment policy statement, I came up with a couple of things. Number one, the objective being that we need to maintain maximum growth, continued growth, not maximum growth, continued growth of these assets that are going to be used to fund your retirement goals, as well as make sure they're managed in a way that we pass on a legacy to Jeffrey and Lewis. Now, when it came to risk tolerance, the two of you had indicated to me in our previous meeting that you were moderate risk takers, and we had several conversations on that to determine what that meant. We went through a suitability questionnaire, and you really did have a good sense of what your risk tolerance was. So I would like to commend you on that. So what this ultimately comes down to is I have a target allocation for you. And when I speak about allocation, I just mean high level, what asset classes are we using and what exposure do we want to have to those individual asset classes? And what I've come up with based on your risk tolerance to be in alignment with the moderate risk tolerance with an objective of growth with income is 55% equity or stocks, 40% fixed income, and 5% alternatives. And alternatives are going to be your real estate, commodities, etc. When thinking about liquidity, I know we're looking at really accessing these funds as soon as possible. So within the next 1 to 7 years is when these assets need to be liquid for you, and that we're looking for a required return of about 5% a year pre-tax. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention as when it comes to selection criteria is I am going to draft these recommendations for you specifically, and they're going to be approved by you, meaning I will not have any discretionary authority in your accounts, and every investment decision will need to be approved by the individual who owns the account. On top of that, this is not a set it and forget it strategy. We are going to continue to meet as we continue to work through financial planning together to continue to make sure we track the investment portfolio and that we make sure that we stay in accordance with that asset allocation that we're setting up. Now, looking at it today, your allocation today across the three accounts that we spoke about earlier is 6% money market, so you've got some money on the sidelines not doing much. You've got 57.6% in equities and then 36.3% in fixed income. So I already shared with you the 55% stocks, 40% bonds, 5% alternatives allocation. I want to take that a layer deeper. So what I'm recommending for your portfolios is 55% stocks, but of the portfolio, 27.5% is going to be in large cap equity, with 13.75% being in small and mid cap equity, and 13.75% being international equity, as we want to make sure we're not putting all of our eggs in the domestic basket. And then on top of that, the 45% fixed income and the 5% alternatives, bringing us to a grand total of 100% for your portfolio and bringing your allocation in alignment to minimize the unsystematic risk in the portfolio while also sticking to a set allocation that you're comfortable with in your risk tolerance. I look forward to working with the two of you in the coming weeks to implement these specific recommendations.